The foreclosure notice was still in his hand when the black SUVs arrived. Ethan Walker hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He stood in the center of his diner, Carol's diner, holding that single sheet of paper with both hands, the way a man holds something he doesn't want to be holding, the way you hold news that has the power to end one version of your life completely. The morning light came through the front window in long, pale strips and fell across the counter, across the empty stools, across the photograph on the shelf behind the register. Carol, laughing, her apron dusted with flour, caught in a moment she hadn't known anyone was watching. Ethan looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he heard the engines. Welcome back to State of Valor, where the most powerful acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when everything is being lost. Silver Creek, Montana, was a town that had forgotten how to believe in itself. You could feel it in the empty storefronts along the main street, in the way people walked with their eyes slightly down, in the conversations that circled endlessly around what used to be here and never landed on what could be. The mountain still rose magnificent behind the town every morning, indifferent and eternal, but the people beneath them had grown small with disappointment in the way that people do when hope has been deferred too many times. Walker's Diner had survived where everything else had closed, not through clever business decisions or favorable timing, but through the single-minded, unreasonable refusal of one man to quit. Ethan Walker was 47 years old and had hands of someone 20 years older, roughened by decades of kitchen work and cold Montana mornings and the particular kind of labor that comes from doing everything yourself because there is no one left to help you. He opened the diner at 5:30 every morning. He closed it after the last customer left every night. In between, he cooked and cleaned and served and washed and did it all again day after day in the building where Carol had spent the best years of her life believing that feeding people was the most honest form of love a person could practice. Carol had been gone 2 years. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that gives you no warning and very little time. 4 months from diagnosis to the morning Ethan sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, and felt the moment her grip went still. She had been the kind of woman whose absence reshapes the entire architecture of a life. After she died, Ethan would sometimes reach the end of a long shift and turn to say something to her, a small thing, nothing important, the kind of observation you share with someone simply because they are there, and the finding of empty space where she used to be was a grief that never once got smaller with repetition. He kept her photograph behind the register because he needed to be able to look at her face during the difficult moments and remember what all of it was for. The town had been Carol's idea originally. The feeding of anyone who came through the door hungry, regardless of their ability to pay. She had believed with her whole self that no one should leave a meal hungry if you had food to give. And Ethan had loved her enough to make her belief his own. After she died, he continued it, not as tribute exactly, more as continuity, as the stubborn insistence that the version of this place she had loved would outlast her absence. The town did not see it that way. That's why he can't make rent. Carol had sense. He's got sentiment, not the same thing. Feeding every drifter who walks through the door and then wondering why he's broke. Ethan heard the talk. Silver Creek was not a large town, and talk traveled in it the way cold air travels, through every gap, into every room, impossible to fully keep out. He heard it, and he unlocked his door every morning anyway, turned the sign from closed to open in the gray pre-dawn quiet, and started a fresh pot of coffee for a dining room that was increasingly empty. 3 months behind on the lease, 2 suppliers who had stopped calling back, a walk-in cooler running 4 degrees too warm, and a compressor replacement he had been deferring for longer than was wise. The numbers did not lie, and Ethan was not a man who lied to himself. He knew what was coming, had known for months, had simply chosen to keep moving until he couldn't. He just hadn't expected it to come on a Tuesday. The man had first appeared 3 weeks earlier, on a night when the storm came down from the mountains with the kind of violence that felt personal. Wind driving the rain nearly horizontal, the gravel lot outside the diner turned to a shallow lake, the temperature dropping so fast you could feel it change between 1 minute and the next. Ethan had been about to lock up. The dining room was empty, the kitchen cleaned, the last of the coffee long since poured out. The door opened, and the man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that announced itself quietly, not aggressive, not performative, simply there, the way a large and solid thing is simply there. He was soaked through entirely, his dark jacket heavy with rain, his face carrying an exhaustion that had nothing to do with one bad night, and everything to do with a weight that had been accumulating for a very long time. He stood in the doorway without speaking and looked at Ethan with eyes that were calm and watchful and profoundly, irreparably tired. Beside him was the dog, a German shepherd, large, with a chest like a barrel and a coat that would have been magnificent under better circumstances, but was now soaked flat and dark with rain. He moved with a slight unevenness in his left rear leg, an old injury healed imperfectly, the kind that flares in cold weather and is simply endured. But his eyes were extraordinary, amber and alert, and carrying an intelligence that made you feel not just seen, but evaluated, assessed at a level below the social. Ethan looked at the man. He looked at the dog. He set down his dish towel. "You both look like you've been through hell," he said. "Sit. Eat." He went to the kitchen without waiting for a response. He heated what remained from the evening, a beef stew he'd made that morning, rich and slow-cooked, the kind of food that warms from the inside out. He plated it generously, then cut a separate portion and set it in a bowl. He carried everything out and set the plate in front of the man and placed the bowl and a dish of warm water on the floor near the dog, doing it without ceremony, without making it a gesture, simply because it was what needed doing. The man stared at his plate for a moment. Then he began to eat. The dog did not eat immediately. He stood watching Ethan from across the diner floor with those extraordinary eyes, and then he began to move, slowly, with a deliberateness that felt considered rather than instinctive, across the floor, toward where Ethan stood quietly behind the counter. He stopped in front of Ethan. He looked up at him for a long moment. And then, with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible in an animal his size, the dog lowered his great head and rested it against Ethan's hand. The diner went very still. Ethan did not move. He did not speak. He simply let his hand rest lightly against the dog's wet fur and stood completely still, breathing slowly, understanding without being told that something fragile and significant was happening and that the only right response was to receive it quietly. "His name is Rex." The man's voice was low and controlled, the voice of someone for whom words were tools used with precision rather than abundance. He hadn't turned around. He doesn't do that. He hasn't done that with anyone since... He stopped, set his fork down, in a long time. "He's welcome here. So are you." They came back the following night, and every night after that. The man never offered his name. Ethan never asked for it. He arrived after dark, always quiet, always with Rex moving close at his left side, not the practiced heel of obedience training alone, but the specific closeness of two beings who had been through something together that had permanently altered the distance between them. Ethan fed them both without comment or condition. Sometimes the man sat for an hour in complete silence, and Ethan gave him the silence without filling it, understanding instinctively that what was being offered in those quiet hours was not conversation, but simply the presence of another human being who was not demanding anything. Once, on a night when Rex was restless and the man's jaw was set in a way that spoke of something internal and difficult, Ethan came around from behind the counter and simply sat on the stool beside him, not talking, not asking, just present, the way you sit with someone who is carrying more than they should have to carry alone, offering the small but real testimony of your company. Rex had put his head in Ethan's lap that night and stayed there for a long time. The town continued to talk. A supplier called to inform Ethan his account was being closed. Too many outstanding invoices, nothing personal. Ethan thanked him with genuine courtesy and hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long moment with his palm flat against the counter, steadying himself before going back out front. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. The last night came on a Thursday. Ethan had taken inventory that morning with the careful thoroughness of someone who already knows what they're going to find. The result was a single serviceable meal, beef and root vegetables, enough for one plate, stretched as far as it would go. He cooked it slowly and well, with the full attention he brought to every plate regardless of circumstance, because Carol believed that care in cooking was care for the person eating, and he had never found a reason to disagree with her. He was standing behind the counter looking at that plate when the door opened and the man walked in with Rex earlier than usual, arriving in the gray evening light with the particular quiet of someone who senses, without being told, that something has shifted. Ethan looked at the man, he looked at Rex, he looked at the plate. He picked up his knife and divided the portion. The larger half slid onto the plate, the smaller portion placed carefully into Rex's bowl on the floor. He set the plate in front of the man. He poured himself a glass of water. He leaned back against the counter behind the register, beside Carol's photograph, and he smiled, a real smile, small and unhurried, and completely at peace.
"I'll eat tomorrow," he said quietly. "You two need it more tonight." The man looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his face, a fracture, brief and deep in the careful stillness he wore like a second skin before it closed again. He looked down at his plate. Rex did not go to his bowl. He crossed the diner floor and pressed himself against Ethan's legs, his full weight leaning in, solid and warm and unwavering. He looked up at Ethan with those amber eyes and held the look, and in it was something that had no word in human language, but that Ethan felt in the center of his chest like a hand placed gently over a wound. Not pity, not even sympathy, something older and more honest than either. Ethan reached down and laid his hand on Rex's head. "Good boy," he whispered. His voice broke on the second word. He didn't try to recover it. He stood there in his nearly empty diner, one hand on his dog's head, because in that moment Rex was his dog, undeniably, and the other hand resting beside Carol's photograph, and he let himself feel the full weight of everything he was about to lose. The counter where she used to stand, the kitchen where she had taught him her mother's recipes on Sunday mornings, the front window where she used to watch the snow come down and say that Montana was the most beautiful place on earth and she couldn't imagine living anywhere else.
He stood there and grieved it all quietly, with Rex pressed warm against his legs, while the man at the counter sat very still and said nothing, and the diner held them all in its worn and faithful walls. The foreclosure notice arrived the next morning. Ethan read it standing behind the register. He set it face down on the counter. He looked at Carol's photograph for a long time, at her flour-dusted apron, at her unguarded laugh, at the particular light in her eyes that he had spent 2 years trying to find in other places and never had. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I tried to keep it. I really tried." He was still standing there, still holding the notice, when he heard the engines outside. Not the familiar sounds of Silver Creek mornings, not pickup trucks and delivery vans and the distant school bus making its rounds. These were heavier, more deliberate, moving in a formation that spoke of coordination and purpose. Ethan walked to the front window and looked out. 3 black SUVs sat in a line along the street in front of his diner. Men in dark suits stood along the sidewalk with the contained stillness of trained professionals. A small crowd had gathered already. Silver Creek gathered quickly for anything unusual, standing in uncertain clusters, their morning coffee going cold in their hands. Then the door opened. The man stepped inside. He was transformed entirely. Same face, same build, same quiet, measuring eyes, but everything surrounding him had changed. The suit that fit like authority, the bearing that belonged to someone accustomed to having decisions rest on his words, the way he moved through a space as though it accommodated itself to him rather than the other way around. Rex moved at his left side, and Rex too was different. Not the exhausted, rain-soaked animal of 3 weeks ago, but something powerful and deliberate and fully present, moving with the fluid precision of an animal in complete command of himself. The man walked to the counter and stood before Ethan Walker. "My name is Adrian Cross," he said. His voice in the quiet of the diner was steady and full and carried the weight of a man who had learned to speak in conditions where his words determined outcomes. Former Navy SEAL, currently the founder and owner of one of the largest private security firms in the country. Somewhere in the crowd gathered outside the window, someone made a sound. Adrian continued without pause. "Rex served with me for 6 years, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq. He located IEDs that saved entire convoys of men who never knew how close they came to dying. He ran into burning buildings and collapsed structures when no human being would follow. He pulled men out of situations that had no survivable exit." His voice remained steady, but something in it deepened, became more careful. "In our last deployment, there was an explosion during a night operation. Rex was close to it. Too close. He survived, but something in him—" Adrian paused for only a moment. He stopped trusting anyone, even men he'd worked beside for years, even me some days. The handlers said it might be permanent. Rex had left Adrian's side and crossed the diner to Ethan. He was pressing his full weight against Ethan's legs, his head turned upward. Adrian looked at the dog for a moment before he continued. "I spent a year after leaving the service trying to understand who I was without the mission. What I kept coming back to was a question: whether the thing we were fighting to protect still existed. Whether ordinary people still carried the kind of decency that makes a country worth defending." He looked at Ethan directly. "I came to Silver Creek. I walked through your door in a rainstorm with nothing identifying me, nothing to offer. And you fed me. You fed him. every night, without condition, without expectation, until you had one plate left and nothing in your kitchen, and you split it between us and went to bed on water." His voice for the first time shifted, quieter, and underneath the controls something real and unguarded. "Rex told me what kind of man you were before I did. He hasn't trusted anyone since the explosion. Not like that. Not the way he trusts you." Ethan's eyes were full. His hand was on Rex's head. Adrian placed a folder on the counter and opened it. Debt records marked paid in full. Lease documents transferred to Ethan's name, owned outright, no conditions. An investment proposal with a number that made Ethan's breath leave his body entirely. "There's one requirement," Adrian said, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "This diner stays open, and that table in the back corner, that table is always reserved, always free for any veteran who walks through the door." He extended his hand across the counter. Ethan looked at it. He looked at Carol's photograph. He looked down at Rex, who was leaning against him with his whole warm, solid weight, those amber eyes calm and steady and completely at peace. Ethan Walker shook Adrian Cross's hand, and then for the first time in 2 years, he wept, not from grief, not from relief entirely, but from something that lived beneath both of those things, something that felt like Carol's hand on his shoulder, like the specific warmth of being seen fully and found worthy. Rex stayed pressed against his legs through all of it, unwavering, certain, home. The table in the back corner had a small handwritten sign above it now, in Ethan's own handwriting on a piece of cardstock. "You served, you eat, no exceptions." Veterans passed through Silver Creek in ones and twos and sat at that table and ate without paying, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. And Ethan served them all with the same quiet dignity he brought to every plate he had ever set down in this building. Adrian came most mornings. He sat in the corner with his coffee and his work and said little, and Rex slept beneath the counter at Ethan's feet, deeply, peacefully, the sleep of an animal who has finally, after a very long time, found the one place in the world where he is completely safe. Some mornings, Ethan would look down at that sleeping dog and then up at Carol's photograph and feel the particular quality of a moment that is exactly what it is supposed to be. Nothing more needed, nothing missing, the world momentarily, improbably, in its right arrangement. He would start a fresh pot of coffee. He would unlock the door. He would turn the sign from closed to open in the early morning quiet. And he would wait with genuine and unhurried patience for whoever needed to come in from the cold. Some people show their courage on the battlefield. Others show it every single morning by choosing kindness again, even when it costs them everything, even when no one is watching, even when the world has stopped deserving it. That is not weakness. That is the rarest form of strength there is. If this story touched something in you, subscribe to State of Valor and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist. This story carries truths that go beyond its narrative. Combat veterans returning from service frequently struggle with a form of moral injury, not just trauma from what they witnessed, but a deep disillusionment about the world they fought to protect. Adrian Cross's silent test is not fictional invention. It reflects the real psychological reality of many veterans who cannot simply re-enter civilian life and trust it. They need evidence, repeated and unperformed, that human goodness is real before they can believe in it again. Rex's arc reflects what research on military working dogs has confirmed. These animals develop genuine post-traumatic stress responses. They form profound bonds with their handlers, and the breaking of those bonds through the violence of combat can produce lasting behavioral changes that mirror human PTSD in remarkable ways. Rex is not a device in this story. He is a portrait of a real kind of suffering that most people never consider. At its moral center, the story confronts a lie that struggling communities often internalize, that compassion is a privilege of the comfortable, that you must be stable before you can afford to be generous. Ethan Walker disproves this quietly and completely. His kindness is most powerful precisely because it costs him something real, because it is chosen repeatedly in the face of loss rather than performed from a position of security. This story teaches that service does not end with a discharge, that loyalty, human and canine, is built not in grand moments, but in small, private ones that nobody is watching, and that the people who keep their goodness intact when the world gives them every reason to surrender it are the people who change everything they touch.